I was born by the river in a little tent, and oh, just like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gon' come. Oh, yes it will. It's been too hard living, but I am afraid to die, 'cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gon' come. Oh, yes it will. There's been times that I thought I wouldn't last for long, but somehow.
In the early years of American history, Africans did not come to America by choice. They were brought here against their will by slave traders, and for over 200 years slavery existed in American culture. After the Civil War ended from 1865 to 1868, a series of 3 constitutional amendments were passed to provide more rights to the African Americans. Slavery was outlawed through the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment put into law the legal equality of ex-slaves, and the 15th Amendment provided voting rights for ex-slaves. African Americans hoped that they would now enjoy the same freedoms and opportunities as white Americans. However, even though the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, African Americans in the southern United States were not receiving any benefit from the new laws because southern white people found ways to restrict their rights. Southern states also created segregation laws to separate blacks from whites, including not being able to use the same bathrooms, eat in the same restaurants, drink from the same water fountains, use public transportation, and they had to sit at the back of the buses and give up their seats for white people if there weren't enough seats. By the mid-1900s, a movement began in which millions of people worked to win fair treatment for African Americans. This era became known as the Civil Rights Movement, or the African American Civil Rights Movement. The following stories are just a few of the brave warriors of change who led others in the movement and forever changed the world. A young, gifted attorney named Thurgood Marshall was named Chief Legal Counsel of the NAACP in the late 1940s and argued and won several civil rights cases on their behalf. He also established the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which was used to challenge several anti-segregation cases in the 1950s, including the landmark case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka case, which Thurgood Marshall argued before the Supreme Court and won. Winning this case meant that blacks could attend all the same schools as whites, from elementary to postgraduate levels. The work of Thurgood Marshall and his team allowed current and future generations of blacks to dream of a better future through education. Because of all his accomplishments, in 1967, Thurgood Marshall was appointed the first African American Supreme Court Justice. On December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks was riding home on a public bus after a long day's work as a seamstress at a local department store. As the bus became full and there were no seats left on the bus, she was asked by the bus driver to give up her seat to a white man. Rosa Parks refused. This one act of bravery sparked the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott and inspired mass civil rights protests elsewhere, which sped the pace of the civil rights reform. Despite violent acts towards organizers and protesters, the boycott continued for almost a year until November 1956, when the NAACP won a Supreme Court order to desegregate the bus system. With this victory, it was then illegal to treat blacks any differently than whites on public buses. Dr. Martin Luther King's initial prominent role was as one of the key organizers of the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. He also organized mass nonviolent protests, including sit-ins and the Freedom Rides. As a result of all these protests, in 1963, President John F. Kennedy introduced legislation that was the framework for the future Civil Rights Act of 1964. To convince Congress to pass this law, in 1963, King and other organizers arranged the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which attracted over 200,000 participants, and was the event that inspired King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
The law was successfully passed on July 1, 1964, which allowed desegregation in all public places. On the evening of April 4, 1968, he was assassinated. He died fighting for what he believed in. His bravery and method of nonviolent protests brought attention to the unfair treatment of blacks and changed the lives of millions of people of that era and for many future generations. On February 1, 1960, 4 black college students, Ezell A. Blair Jr., Frank E. McCain, Joseph A. McNeil, and David L. Richmond sparked a new phase of the Southern Civil Rights Movement when they staged a sit-in at a drugstore lunch counter reserved for whites. After this event, thousands of students in at least 60 communities in the South joined the sit-in campaign during the winter and spring of 1960. James Farmer was director of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, where he organized and led the first Freedom Ride on May 4, 1961. The goal of the Freedom Rides was to raise awareness of the racists in the South who ignored the recently passed law for desegregation in interstate transportation. They sent racially mixed groups on Greyhound and Trailway buses where whites would sit in the back of the bus and blacks in the front, and at least one mixed pair would always sit together. At rest stops, whites would use black bathrooms and blacks would use white bathrooms, and they would eat together at whites-only lunch counters. A lot of violent backlash occurred and many protesters suffered. But it drew attention to the fact that these laws were not being enforced. Due to the Freedom Rides in late 1961, stronger laws and enforcement were put in place. As you can see, through the bravery of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders, men and women, the lives of African American citizens were forever changed for the better. The result is that today, African Americans share in the freedoms that only white Americans had previously enjoyed. These freedoms have allowed many African Americans to accomplish things that were never even dreamed of prior to this civil rights movement. It is an example to all citizens of the world of how even one person can make the world a better place. My hope is that through this documentary, even one person is inspired to make a difference. even if it's just volunteering to help a fellow citizen make their life a little better.